Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Evie Hout, and I am the Program Specialist at Be Active Kids. Today we welcome Dr. Diane Kraft. Dr. Kraft has been working since 1998 to improve the physical activity opportunities for preschool children with and without disabilities. She established Active Playbooks in 2007 to provide a platform to make her knowledge and ideas accessible for child care providers and managers of child-focused organizations. Dr. Kraft teaches in the Physical Education Department at State University of New York at Cortland. She has won numerous professional awards for her work and has given over 100 presentations and workshops on preschool physical activities to local, state, national, and international audiences. We are happy to have her with us today to share her knowledge and experience with young children. Please know that in order to receive your CHC for this webinar, you will need to remain present throughout the webinar, take part in both polls, and complete the follow-up survey that will be sent to you shortly after the webinar. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started.
Well, welcome everybody. Again, my name is Diane Kraft, and I'm delighted to have this chance to present the webinar on active play, including toddlers and preschoolers with disabilities in physical activities with their typical peers. Next slide, please. And I'm very much a proponent of inclusion, so my whole perspective is that it's individuals with and without disabilities participating in activities together. And again, here's the my affiliation. And then next slide, here's what we're going to be looking at. So I'd like to share some common characteristics of preschoolers with special needs, and then share specific examples of physical activities that can be inclusive for toddlers and preschoolers with and without physical activity or disabilities to participate in together. And finally, consider guidelines for leading inclusive physical activities. Next slide. So here's a list of some of the most common special needs of toddlers and preschoolers. And many young children may have speech or language delays, or may have developmental delays, not yet specifically identified, but just behind a bit in terms of their development. And increasingly, many young children are on the autism spectrum, and some may have intellectual disabilities or emotional difficulties. And of course, many young children are suspected to have ADHD, attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder. Now, what I didn't list here are the less common special needs of young children, like visual impairments or hearing impairments or orthopedic impairments or cerebral palsy and so forth. My perspective is that everybody can participate in physical activities together. But I'm just emphasizing here some of the more common special needs of toddlers and preschoolers. Next slide, please. So really, in general, toddlers and preschoolers with special needs share the same characteristics as typical preschoolers, but those characteristics are often more pronounced. Next slide, please. And so a toddler or preschool with special needs may need assistance with communicating. A child may be nonverbal and just starting to learn some basic signs, or starting to talk and needing some assistance with that. Definitely children may have difficulty understanding instructions. I know for myself, I tend to use vocabulary that's a little too advanced for young children, so we have to bump it on down to very simple language, because people aren't going to be able to do what we ask if they don't understand the words we choose to use. Attending to tasks can be a challenge for all toddlers and preschoolers, but it may be even a greater challenge for a child with a special need. And that links to making it sometimes difficult to practice a skill, to learn it. If someone's attention is flitting from here to there and everywhere, then it's a challenge to help them focus and repeat a task so they can practice and actually master that task. Again, all preschoolers and toddlers typically have a little difficulty sharing and working with others, but that can be even more pronounced if a child has an emotional difficulty or on the autism spectrum In that case, the child may not wish to interact with others. And there may be a need to increase or decrease the child's activity level. If a child's very hyperactive, then we're trying to help them focus. But if a child is quite sedentary, and that may be the case for some individuals with Down syndrome, then we're trying to light a fire under them and get them up and active to increase their activity level. Next slide, please. But regardless, physical activity is important for all toddlers and preschoolers. Next slide, please. And here, I'd like to address what we're looking at in terms of what we want the child to be able to do. So for typically developing children from age 2 to age 6, 7, or 8, they're in the fundamental movement phase. And that's when they're learning and developing to the mature level all those skills shown on the left-hand side in the locomotor skills, object control skills, and stability, or non-locomotor skills. If a child has a developmental delay, they may still be working on their fundamental movement skills and need lots and lots of practice in all of these skills. Next slide, please. But if a child has a significant developmental delay, they may be between the ages of 2 and 6, 7, or 8, which would, for typically developing children, be the fundamental movement phase. But this child may need to spend more time in the previous phase, the rudimentary movement phase. And that's where they're learning locomotor skills, such as scooting on their butt, or crawling with belly on the floor, or creeping up on hands and knees, or walking on all fours. And they're working on the upright gait, walking with support, and eventually walking alone. Or they're working on basic things like head and neck control. That can be particularly challenging if a child has cerebral palsy, and sitting and standing posture, and then manipulative skills, grasping, releasing, reaching, and so forth. So if the child is in the fundamental movement phase, then we're working toward the goals on the previous slide. But if the child is in the rudimentary movement phase, then we're working on the goals shown here. Next slide, please. And across, regardless of which phase the child might be in at this point, we're looking to develop physical fitness, the cardiovascular endurance, their muscular strength and endurance, and flexibility. Next slide, please. So a general way of approaching modifying a task with an individual who may have a special need is to look at how can we modify the environment, and/or how can we modify the task to fit the characteristics of this particular individual. And I'll be sharing lots of examples shortly of physical activities and sharing ways of modifying the environment or modifying the task. Next slide, please. So now we get into the practical part. I'll be sharing several physical activities that have been done successfully with children with and without special needs included in the activities together. And the first one that I'd like to share we just call All Stop and Go to Music. It's very basic, and it's a good way to start out a structured physical activity time when we're asking the children to respond to the activity that the adult is leading. So here, you put on lively music and teach the children to respond to the musical cues. So when the music starts, it means we start moving. And when the music stops, it means we stop and freeze in place. So they're learning to respond to the musical cues. In this particular setting, we've got flat foam pool noodles, and the children are moving all in one direction with us adults around the flat foam pool noodles. Doesn't need to be pool noodles, but it helps if there's something in the middle that organizes the space and the children are moving in the same direction around that as they're learning to respond to music as a signal to stop. Sometimes children can use extra cues, particularly if they are quite impulsive. So in this photo, you see the woman in the green top is holding the hand of the little boy with the cap. And that's so that if he's impulsive and wants to keep moving after the music has stopped, she's holding his hand and she's stopping, so he's getting that kinesthetic feedback of, oh, I guess I'm supposed to stop too. And then what I also do here is I do the American Sign Language symbol of stop, where one hand on edge cuts to the open palm of the other hand, so it's a clear stop signal. Or just put your hand out and like a stop, so that the children who might have difficulty attending to the music are also getting the kinesthetic feedback and they're getting the visual feedback. And this is a good one to work on practicing impulse control, because for a lot of young children, particularly any with ADHD, they're going to be pretty interested in still going and not stopping on cue. So this is a great way to practice that important skill. Next slide, please. This next activity we call Clean Up the Floor. Not original to us, but what we're throwing is. Can you tell in the picture what they're throwing? Yeah, those are rolled socks. They're lightweight, they're not going to hurt if you get hit in the face with a sock, and they're readily available. So the way this works is we've got a barrier, which you can kind of make out. That's a rope with a sheet thrown over it, stretched across the room. And the children on one side of the barrier are trying to throw all the rolled socks and other soft objects to the other side. But the children on that other side are trying to get all those rolled socks back to the original side. So it's a recipe for controlled chaos and a lot of practice with that fundamental movement skill of throwing. An example of modifying the environment is here, because we could have just put a tape line or a rope on the floor and say if you're on one side of that rope, you're trying to get all the objects to the other side and vice versa. But that's not a very clear boundary, and we're likely to have lots of children just ignore that rope or tape on the floor and run to the other side. But when we have a waist-high barrier with a cloth thrown over it, a sheet thrown over it, that's a very clear boundary, and it helps children understand, stand here, throw over there. However, when it comes to the rules, I still like to be as relaxed as possible and only have the minimum number of rules. So if a young child is throwing from one side and then ducks under and picks up a sock on the other side and throws it back, and they're going from side to side, they're not staying on one team or the other, that's fine, because our overall purpose is for the children to get practice throwing. I really de-emphasize winning. I don't go until one team gets all the socks on the other side, and that almost never happens anyway. And when I'm done, I don't have the children count up which side has more socks on it. No, the whole focus is on throwing and having fun and getting lots of practice with throwing. Plus, if you do this for a while, you'll find it's quite a cardiovascular workout as well. Next slide, please. And actually, I would like to add one more thing with the previous slide. Sorry about that. If a child has a physical disability, again, maybe cerebral palsy, and might be in wheelchair or mobile prone stander or something, then that child can be positioned right next to the rope and work on the skill that might be very demanding for this child to grasp the sock and pick it up and drop it the other side of the barrier. So that children who are very skilled and can stand far back from the barrier and throw a long distance across the barrier, and children who are very challenged physically can be right next to the barrier, everybody participating together. So again, those comments apply to the clean up the floor that we just saw before. Now I'd like to talk about the slide you see here, spiders and bugs. This one's a great one because it requires no equipment, you don't need to move any furniture, you just move among the furniture. And it's a tag game, but it's set up to be non-elimination. So in the way it works is one person starts out as a spider, up on their hands and feet, so their butts up in the air, and scurry along the floor, trying to tag all the other children, and they're bugs. So they're on their hands and knees, so their butt's not up in the air, and they're scurrying away, trying to not get tagged gently on the shoulder or back by the spider. If a child is tagged by the spider, then they're not eliminated. They just become a spider and a tagger also. So they go back up onto their hands and feet and try to catch and tag the remaining bugs. It usually takes about 15 or 30 seconds until everybody's converted from being a spider, or from being a bug, I should say, to being a spider or a tagger. And I like this very much because it is non-elimination, so there's no arguments necessary about, you tagged me, no you didn't. You know, you're a spider, you're not out. Now you've got a tagger role, and that helps out. Plus, if there's a child who, either due to emotional difficulties or just their disposition, tends to be very argumentative, by the time they start to have an argument, whether they were tagged or not, 3 other spiders have touched them. They're definitely a spider, so it's very quick. It moves fast and avoids a lot of those arguments. Of course, we do need to teach children to use gentle touches on the shoulder or back when they're tagging, and that's an opportunity for the adult to assist the child who might have a little motoric difficulty in getting along and doing this activity with others. Next slide, please. This activity is called matching socks, and it's what we call a carry game, in that children start out at one end of the open space and pick up a sock and then run down to the other end, and among all the socks spread out there, look for the exact match for the sock they have in their hand. So for this, you need lots of matching pairs of socks. So it's not going to work with that sock that ends up after the laundry and you can't find the mate. You need to have pairs of socks where the 2 socks are identical. And to set it up, you separate the socks, so one of each pair is at the starting end, and then the other of each pair is at the far end of the open space. Then I like to turn on the music as a signal to begin the activity, and the children pick up the sock, run down to the other end, look among all the different patterned and colored socks there, find the exact match for the one in their hand, come back. It's kind of nice to show it to the adult at that point, and you could have a conversation. What color is the sock, and is there a picture on the sock? What's the picture of, and so forth. And then the child who's finished just picks up another sock, goes down, finds the mate, and so forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's really important to not make all the children wait until everyone has come back with their match for the first sock before they get to go look for the match for the second sock. It should be continuous. As soon as any child comes back, they get another sock, they go down, they look for it, and so forth. Now, and of course this is reinforcing the cognitive concept of matching. It's also an opportunity to practice their locomotor skills. So initially the children could be running down and back, but then it can be changed so now they're jumping down and back, or hopping, or tiptoeing, or walking backwards, or whatever. So, or if it's a suitable surface, they can be creeping as they go down and back, or doing the log roll. And opportunities here for including children of varying abilities together. So if there's a child who's much younger or has a significant developmental delay and is not really understanding the concept of matching, then this child can be assisted in making the match by the other children. But if in the same group there's another child who's far more advanced and understands their colors, they're in good shape, then I like to incorporate some socks that are white but differ in other ways. So there could be a pair of white socks that's got a popcorn weave, another pair that's got a straight weave, and another that might have a wavy weave, and they could be larger and smaller white socks and so forth. So for this more advanced child, color is no cue. They have to pay attention to other characteristics of the socks for making the exact matches. Next slide, please. This activity is the first of 3 using the same piece of equipment, and this one we call easy catching. And it's a chance for children to practice their eye-hand coordination. What you see here is a balloon, a punch bowl quality balloon, inflated in the butt of a pantyhose. so that the balloon is completely encased within the pantyhose, so it's not presenting the choking hazard that balloons can present if they're uncovered and a child bites the balloon, pops it, inhales the shard, and could suffocate. So we're trying hard to make sure that that's not going to happen by completely encasing the balloon in the butt of the pantyhose. And then it's tethered by the pantyhose legs from that horizontal rope. Because it's tethered, it means the children can get lots of opportunities to practice kicking over and over and over again, because that balloon's going to swing back for them to kick again and again. It also means that if a child has very limited motor abilities, again, perhaps spastic cerebral palsy or some other condition where moving is challenging for the child, then even a light tap with the foot is going to send that balloon swinging away. Or if they're in a wheelchair and using their arms instead of their feet, they could tap it with their hands. It really helps because the balloons are tethered, so everybody's in contained space. And then we make sure that this works because we structure the environment. We put the balloons on this rope far enough apart that the children are not going to be kicking each other. Next slide, please. So here's a variation. We've now hoisted the horizontal rope up overhead, and now the balloon, when it's extended, it's in the photo here, it's going up in the air, but when it's extended, it's going to be at about waist or chest height of the child. And so it's a great opportunity to practice the catching. Actually, it's volleying. So contacting the balloon with the open hand or the fist. So we just call this easy punching. And it presents the opportunity for a child who may have limited physical ability to contact the balloon with any body part that they want. Again, because it's tethered, it's a much easier task. If a child processes information very slowly or may have even a visual delay or visual impairment, if they have some vision, the balloon is suspended and can be in a brightly colored pantyhose or some tights, you know, like neon, so it's going to be easier to see for most children with visual impairments, and then they still can contact the balloon. This is much, much easier than trying to have young children catch a tossed ball or tossed balloon, particularly if it's tossed by another young child. Oh my golly. So there's such opportunities for inaccuracy and lack of success. But when it's tethered, it's much more successful. Next one, please. This activity we call easy striking, and that's the same setup as before with the overhead rope with the balloon suspended from it, but now we're working on striking using a foam pool noodle. And so these pool noodles have been cut in half, so they're about 2 to 2.5 feet in length, and they're used as bats. It's very helpful that they're foam, because if a child should accidentally, or not so accidentally, hit another child with the foam pool noodle, at least it's not going to hurt. We still need to address the behavior. And you see here I have batting as a privilege. In other words, you'll have your own technique for addressing this, but what I often say and do is if a child is hitting someone else with the pool noodle instead of the balloon, then I'll take the pool noodle and say, when you're ready to only strike the balloon, I will give the pool noodle back to you so you can continue that. So we need to teach children how to use the equipment appropriately. And as you note here, we space the balloons far apart so that if the children are not likely to accidentally swing the bat or the pool noodle and hit somebody next to them, because we've created the environment where the balloons are far enough apart that that's not going to happen. Next slide, please. Bubble wrap jumping is a great one for practicing the fundamental movement skill of jumping. And here we've stretched and taped bubble wrap to the floor. We've used clear packing tape to keep it there. It helps to have the larger bubbles. You can kind of see that here. They're about 3/4 of an inch in size. Those very tiny bubbles are too thin, they tear, and they're very hard to pop. But the size that you see here works well. And the popping is what promotes children who might even be reluctant to move to be very interested in jumping, so that when they land, they hear the pop, pop, pop. I've learned a great deal from Renee McCall, who teaches in the North Syracuse School District in New York State. And she tells using this, stretching the bubble wrap on the floor, and having the children who were toddlers and preschoolers enjoy jumping on it. And she talks about a little boy with Down syndrome who was maybe 3 years old and just learning how to walk and very hesitant to walk. It was a lot of work for him. But he was almost running to hear the bubbles pop as he went down the strip of bubble wrap here. So it's about creating the motivation for children to be physically active, even when that physical activity might be a little challenging for the child to do. As you note here, it's important that everyone travels in the same direction so we avoid collisions. And if a child's not yet ready to jump, it's okay that they're walking. But I like to use this activity to encourage children to jump. So if a child has some balance difficulties, I might stand in front of them and extend my arms and hold their hands. So now I'm giving them more balance as they can work on jumping in place, enjoying hearing the popping of the bubbles. Next slide, please. And this next one is a personal favorite. It's called Swat the Fly. And my husband, Craig Smith, is the one that came up with this idea. So all the children are in an open area for running, and approximately half the children can have be draggers, and that's where they've got a vinyl plate that's got a picture of a fly taped with clear packing tape to both sides of the tape or the plate, and then there's a hole drilled through the rim of the plate and a cord attached. And so you see the boy in the green cap is what we call a dragger. He's running, dragging this fly picture on the plate behind him. And then the other boy with the brown hair and the pool noodle is what we call a swatter. So he's trying to run after all these plates, and his pool noodle becomes an imaginary fly swatter. He pretends it's a fly swatter, and he's swatting the fly, the picture of the fly on the plate with that pool noodle. Next slide, please. This activity is a real winner because it's great for promoting cardiovascular endurance. In my experience, children just run and run and run and run to have the delight of swatting these flies. Because most of the time we're telling children don't hit, but in this activity we're saying we want you to hit just the flies on the plates, not each other, but we want you to hit, and they're usually very happy to do that. In fact, in my experience, the children are very good about only hitting the plates. Sometimes when I do workshops, the adults use this as an opportunity to tease each other and hit each other, but the children are usually really good about just hitting the plates. And this activity allows children to participate at their own level. When I first did this activity in a class where there were children on the autism spectrum and some with orthopedic impairments and some who were typically developing, after introducing it and starting the activity and turning on the music to signal to begin the activity, I stood back and watched, and what I saw was that each child found a way to participate at his or her own level. So the children who had orthopedic impairments and could only walk with much effort at a moderate pace found the flies that were being dragged slowly and went after those, whereas the children who could run very quickly wanted the challenge of the flies being dragged very quickly and went after those. So one of the things that I really look for in inclusive physical activities with toddlers and preschoolers is, can I build in a range of challenges so that more skilled and less skilled children can all participate together, but each at a level of challenge that's appropriate for their individual abilities. Next slide, please. So the next part I'd like to address are just some general teaching strategies that can apply to all preschoolers and toddlers, but might be particularly relevant to toddlers and preschoolers with special needs. Next slide, please. And what I'm focusing on here are structured physical activities. And then again, that's where the adult has decided on the activity and is leading the children in it. Free play is very important for children, and I'm taking nothing away from free play, but the focus today is on structured physical activity or adult-led physical activities. So some things that can be helpful in having this go well is have a very clear beginning to the physical activity and clearly identifying the boundaries and rehearsing those boundaries with the children. So what I often do is either I use a rope boundary, like a rope on the floor, we stay within this, or if it's a carpet, then we stay on the carpet. Whatever it is, I try to mark the boundaries clearly, and then I help the children, well, actually I check, do the children understand the boundaries? So I'll stand inside the boundary and ask, can I stand here? Yes. Then I'll step outside the boundary and can I go here? No. So I check for understanding, make sure that they do understand where they're to be and where they're to not be. And then give a brief explanation and followed by a demonstration of how to do the activity. And if you work with young children, you know you've got about 2 minutes, and after that they're not listening anyway, so it's got to be really brief. With toddlers, I usually make it even less than that. In fact, you may have better success in other ways with toddlers, but when I work with toddlers, I usually start with just a few toddlers and start an activity and then let the others see what's going on and join, because it's sometimes difficult. I mean, we're not going to get toddlers to stand on the line and listen to instructions and start on cue. That doesn't happen too often. So I like to just get it started with a few children and then entice the other children to join in the activity. Music, as I mentioned earlier, is a great way for signaling the beginning and the end of the physical activity. So when the music begins, it means start the activity that's already been explained, and when the music ends, it means time to stop and listen for more instructions. When the children are engaged in the activity, that's a time that we can give lots of feedback. Maybe we can prompt them. If it's a jumping activity, can they swing their arms and bend their knees and jump as they're doing it? Or if it's striking, like the pool noodles to the suspended balloons, we can maybe give hand-over-hand assistance to help them with the striking movement. So it's a great opportunity to give feedback to individual children once all the children are involved in the activity. But if something looks like it's going to potentially become unsafe, of course we stop the activity right then. Next slide, please. And as I've mentioned earlier, we need to teach the children to use equipment safely and respectfully. Just like we teach children to learn anything else, teaching use of the equipment is part of what we have to teach. And quick transitions help out a great deal, because wait time is a time that children might become distracted or start doing things we wish they wouldn't do. Having a clear end of the physical activity helps out, and asking the children to help us put the equipment away and get ready for the next activity helps. What I haven't mentioned yet, but what is critical, is having each children have their own floor spot or carpet square or X on the floor. So this is their own home base. And I find it very helpful to have the children each sit on their own home base while I'm briefly explaining the activity and demonstrating it, and then turn on the music and invite them to get up and do the activity. When I turn off the music, they're to stop, and then I ask them to come back and sit on their home base, explain the next activity, and so forth. It gives some structure that each child has his or her home base to sit on when they're to listen to instructions. And I also like it if there's enough space that the home bases are far enough apart that they can't touch each other. Next slide, please. So those were general teaching strategies. that apply to children with and without disabilities. It's just good, solid teaching. Here's some additional ones that are very important, again, for everybody, but particularly for someone who might have difficulty learning. So we need really simple instructions. I know I tend to talk a lot, but I have to really get it down to just those few key words so the child can understand that and follow those instructions. Giving visual, oral, and kinesthetic cues can help the children understand what to do. So we can physically guide the child through it, we can demonstrate for the visual, and we can give oral cues. Providing plenty of repetition is important. Excuse me. And particularly if children learn slowly, then they're going to need more repetitions to master the same skill as someone who learns very quickly. So doing the activities many times, not necessarily all in a row. We don't want to make the activity become boring, but we might do the activity today, and then in a few days in the future we might do it again, and then next week we might do it again, so they get lots of repetition, whether it's the matching activity or the jumping activity or the striking activity or whatever. So we mix it up. We don't do the activity so much in a row that they become bored and we might get behavior difficulties, but we come back and repeat the activity often so they get that practice needed to master some of their fundamental movement skills. And one of the reasons I really like an inclusive setting is it allows the children who may be typically developing to be the role models for those who might have some special needs. So it's very valuable, I think, to have more advanced children there with the children who are just learning those skills. If someone is using sign language, or often if a child is showing autistic behaviors, it helps to use a communication system like PECS, picture exchange, I forgot what the rest is, picture exchange something system, is the system that's often used with children on the autism spectrum. So they see a picture that shows what they're to do and pass that back and forth with the adult as a way of communicating. And as I've already mentioned earlier, I like to eliminate elimination games because that's denying practice to the children who need the most practice. Those children are the ones who are eliminated first. So what the heck are we doing with elimination games, denying practice to those who need it the most? Next slide, please. And again, just a few other teaching strategies. A general rule of thumb is to adjust the challenge of the activity so a child is successful approximately every 3 out of 4 tries. Because that means it's still hard, they're still not mastering it, they still have to work on it, but they're less likely to become discouraged because they're unsuccessful time and time again. And it's easy to illustrate this in terms of throwing. So if the child's to throw at a target, and at this age I like big targets, you know, like the whole wall could be a target. If they're able to hit the target 3 out of 4 times, then we probably have the challenge about where we want it. But if they're not able to, maybe they need to move closer to the target. If it's too easy, then maybe they need to move back. So we adjust the challenge. If when they're throwing, what we're focused on is learning to step with the foot opposite their throwing arm, then we want to give them lots of prompts and help them be able to do that at least 3 out of 4 tries. So they begin to get down that motor pattern and motor memory that this is the way to do it. I step as I throw. Minimizing waiting time excuse me, is crucial. And some of the activities that you may wish to do involve waiting time. So using stations helps minimize that. So if you were in a preschool classroom setting where there might be 10, 15, 18 children there, and hopefully more than just one adult, then you could set up multiple stations around the room and children rotate among these stations of physical activities. That means you might only, if you've got 4 stations and 16 children, then you only have 4 children at each individual station. And that minimizes the waiting time and keeps things moving very nicely and avoids a lot of behavior difficulties that can come about when children are just standing around. And of course, using equipment that's safe. So here you see it's a padded ball, a lightweight padded ball that's inside the butt of the pantyhose. So it's very soft and not going to hurt anybody. Next slide, please. So the activities that I've shared here, just to give you the resource, they're from the book that I and Craig Smith authored called Active Play, Fun Physical Activities for Young Children. And then there's a website if you have an interest in that. Along with the book, there comes a DVD that shows children doing these physical activities in family child care settings. So 30 up to 52 physical activities in the book are shown on these short video clips with children in family child care settings doing the activity. Next slide, please. And here's my contact information. And the email, I apologize, is cut off at the bottom. So it's my name, diane.craft@cortland, CORTLAND.edu. And next slide, please. Now we're at the questions part. So
That was
welcome
awesome,
some
Diane.
questions.
We have a couple questions for you. So we'll go ahead and start off doing those. What would you say the #1 piece of advice to parents and providers would be as they try to increase physical activity with children who have a disability?
Oh, if I had to say one thing, I would say make it fun. I mean, I'm very focused on there has to be a purpose for the physical activity we select. We're trying to help children develop more mature fundamental movement skills or improve their rudimentary movement skills or practice getting along with others and so forth. So fun is not the objective, but fun is the means to the objective. We all gravitate to what we enjoy doing. So finding physical activities and presenting it in a playful way that's fun for young children makes it so they're likely to continue and want to do this. Sometimes even setting a timer so that we're only going to do this for 10 minutes and then the timer goes off and we're going to stop. We want to stop the activity while it's still fun before we beat it into the ground. And then they're going to be happy to do it again.
That's great advice. Perfect. So we know that physical activity has a positive impact on everyone. We know it's good for everyone to be active. But are there things that we need to keep in mind when working with children with disabilities? Are there any precautions we need to take or any contraindications we need to think about?
There could be, depending on the situation of an individual child. In general, you know, if a child has developmental delay or intellectual disability and so forth, there's usually not too many contraindications. But if their child has a more fragile medical condition, then there may very well be some contraindications. And they're going to be specific to the child, so I think the standard recommendation would be if you're the child care provider or another adult, you definitely talk with the parent to get the background that you need and may also want to contact the physician or the physical therapist involved. And if you're the parent, then of course you want to be in conversation with the physician and therapist to learn if there are any contraindications that you should definitely make sure the child does not do. And as you may know, contraindications mean something that's not recommended. So you'd find out if something is not recommended for that particular child. And a few simple examples. If a child has Down syndrome, I believe it's about 20% of the children have atlantoaxial subluxation, which means there's a little gap. The gap between the first and second vertebrae is a little greater than in typical children and those without atlantoaxial subluxation. So in that case, you want to avoid activities where they're forcefully flexing or hyperextending the head. So no dive forward rolls, no forward rolls, so forth. So that's just a simple example. But if a child has Down syndrome, the parent hopefully would be alerted to this by the physician and would pass that kind of information on to the child care provider.
Great. So making sure we connect with the parents and the pediatrician and possibly the physical therapist if they're working with a physical therapist.
Absolutely.
What would you say are some inexpensive tools or items that would help us as we work to include children with disabilities or just include physical activity in our classrooms overall? What are some inexpensive things that you would suggest everyone to have?
Well, I usually start by focusing on what people already have, either around the house or if it's in a child care setting in the classroom there. And laundry baskets would be one example. Many homes have the plastic laundry baskets, and I love using that activity or that piece of equipment for the activity push and pull baskets. So a child would sit inside the laundry basket and the other children push them across the floor. And everybody gets a turn, so everybody has to help push the others. You've seen the activity with socks. You know, just dump out the sock drawer and use what's there. Pool noodles, inexpensive. If you have the budget, you can get into mats and cones and mini tramps and so forth. But I really like focusing on just what's readily available and how can I repurpose that for physical activity. Another activity that illustrates that, it's really simple. It's not written up anywhere. We just call it cup of tea. And this is in a toddler classroom. There was a little girl who was next to the kitchen area and had a little plastic cup, no water or tea in it, but she was pretending. And she handed it to my husband. Well, we were in the room promoting physical activity. So he took the cup, pretended to drink the tea in it, handed it back to her and said, "May I have some more tea, please?" While she's pretending to get more tea, he's moving across the room. So now she's got to run to him to deliver that cup of tea and then go back to the play kitchen area to pretend to refill it with more tea. So I and the other adult in the room joined the activity, and pretty soon most of the children were running across the room delivering these imaginary cups of tea to us back and forth. So again, that's an example of look what's in the room, look what the children's interests are, and how can I infuse physical activity into this.
That's right. Very creative, too. We like that. And finally, are there any resources that you would recommend for early child care educators to further the knowledge of increasing physical activity with children with disabilities? Are there any specific books out there or resources or websites that you would recommend?
There's a few, and I'm sure there's more that I'm not aware of, but there's a few that are good that I'm aware of. And this is not a resource on the web, but first is go to the physical therapist or the occupational therapist or the speech therapist or the early interventionist or the pediatrician who may be working with the child with a special need and gather ideas and information from them. Each of them has a specialized area of knowledge that can really help us in figuring out how best to facilitate the movement and the engagement and the speech and the learning of children with special needs. Additionally, again, this one's not geared specifically toward children with special needs, but more general and inclusive. There's a Better Kid Care module that is just becoming available. And Better Kid Care is the online learning modules that come out of Pennsylvania State University. And many states and organizations accept the hour of credit of taking this module for their professional development requirements. So the module that's coming out is called Physical Activity for Young Children, Lead with Confidence. And I've had a chance to be a part of that, and some of the activities I shared here are on that and many other ideas. So that's a pretty good online resource for getting more ideas for leading physical activities with young children that can be inclusive. Nurturing Pathways is a program developed by Christine Roberts, and if you Google Nurturing Pathways on the internet, it'll come up. It's a training program. It's not available in every location, but it's got some great ideas for promoting physical activity and the associated brain development of infants and toddlers. Not so much with preschoolers on up, but it's very relevant if the preschooler has a delay and needs more practice. A few articles include one by Joe Cowden and Tori, Motor Development and Movement Activities for Preschoolers and Infants with Delays, and another one by Landy and Burridge, Motor Skills and Movement Station Lesson Plans for Young Children. So those are a few places to start.
Awesome. That was great information, Diane, and we appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. You will receive a follow-up email in the next couple days, and be sure to complete the follow-up survey that will come out. And if you need to get in contact with Diane or Be Active Kids, here's our email. Please email us any additional questions or concerns you might have related to physical activity with children with disabilities. And be sure, if you're interested in the Early Childhood Physical Activity Institute, to join us in May. It's May 22nd and 24th, and it will feature Diane Kraft, Christine Roberts, and a couple other wonderful speakers about physical activity for toddlers and infants. We hope to see you guys there, and we hope you have a great afternoon.